But first, the terror attacks in Brussels. More than 30 people killed in suicide bombings at the airport and a train station this past Tuesday. Now, Belgium is on its highest terror alert level, and communities around the world, even here in Colorado, stepping up security in an effort to uncover and stop attack plots. And Marshall is with Dr. NADER HASHEMI, director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver, to take a closer look at the motivation behind these attacks.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. HaShemi. Now, it's believed that the attack is connected to the capture of Paris bombing suspect Salah Abdeslam, who was arrested just a few days before the attack. Don't attacks like this need more planning than just a few days?
Well, I think they were already in the planning stages. I think what explains this attack is that the capture of Salah Abdeslam, one of the key operatives in the Paris attack, accelerated plans that were already in place, realizing that the noose was tightening on their terror network. And so that explains, I think, the timing.
Does that say we can expect more consistent attacks because this one happened so quickly?
Well, we don't really know for sure. I mean, the best case scenario is that the main cell that was planning attacks have been captured and now has been, eliminated. But the recent reports that we're getting out of ISIS-controlled areas is that ISIS is now planning a new strategy, realizing that they're losing territory in the Middle East. And they're going to try and compensate by staging more attacks in Europe. And they claim that they have a lot of cells, a lot of people who've gone from Europe to ISIS-controlled areas and now have gone back. Figures vary, but a couple hundred people. And so to the extent that they're able to pull off these attacks suggests that what we saw in Brussels is not the last terror attack that we'll be facing.
I mean, it's always the possibility that an attack could happen. So why should Americans not be afraid to travel abroad?
Well, I think they should, keep things in perspective. I think the media attention that these types of terror attacks give is disproportionately related to the actual existing fear that faces Americans when they travel abroad. Europe is still broadly a very safe place. But one of the big distinguishing features, I think, in this whole ISIS crisis is that in the case of Europe, there are these marginalized, discriminated, and alienated communities of young Muslim immigrants who have been recruited by ISIS. We don't have that phenomenon here in the United States. The number of people who are claimed to have left the United States to go to ISIS-controlled areas is at most 200. Many of them have stopped along the way. So it's a very different situation. In the case of Europe, it's 6,000 to 7,000 people who have left Europe. So it's a qualitatively different situation in terms of the overall threat, particularly facing Americans here in the homeland.
We've done some stories locally of Coloradans trying to go overseas and potentially be recruited by ISIS. Is that happening just on a larger scale? Same idea in Europe?
Well, it's happening globally. And of course, ISIS would love to sort of be able to stage a similar type of attack here in the United States. Thankfully, the resources and the basis of support that they have is very narrow. But there is something that's happening that's very dangerous, and that is the American presidential campaign race. The rhetoric that we're seeing from some of the Republican candidates, Ted Cruz and Donald Trump in particular, basic blanket condemnation, patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, denying Muslims access to this country simply because they're Muslims, is actually playing into the narrative of ISIS. Because what ISIS wants to do is send a message to American Muslims: you're not part of this society. Look, you're treated in a discriminatory way. Come and join us. And so if these policies ever get implemented, they will actually be a godsend to the ISIS leadership.
Is that why it's so important for ISIS to claim responsibility for attacks like this so quickly?
Well, yeah, I think they want to show that they're still a living force. They're not losing territory. They're still relevant. They can still stage these attacks. So in many ways, I think some of the weaknesses and the setbacks they've been suffering because of the stepped-up campaign is actually being responded to by staging these dramatic attacks, which really, I think, can be interpreted perhaps as a desperate move by ISIS to sort of still maintain their relevancy in the global media headlines.
So how likely could an attack like this happen in the U.S.?
I think it's actually much lower now, because with every one of these attacks, law enforcement, our intelligence services get better information and are more prepared. So the likelihood is there, but the fundamental reality is these attacks, particularly if they're done by some lone gunman who's become radicalized, like we saw in San Bernardino a few months ago, that's almost impossible to stop. But I mean, the difference in the European situation with the American situation is there are not, Muslim immigrant communities that are marginalized, discriminated against. American Muslims are fully integrated into this society, but they are feeling very anxious hearing some of this rhetoric coming out of the Republican candidates.
All right. Thank you for your perspective, Dr. HaShemi. Now back